It's the 18th of July, of course. It's the birthday of the one and only Nelson Mandela, and today it's celebrated and marked worldwide as International Nelson Mandela Day. Now, a short while ago, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres delivered the 18th Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture, marking, of course, this day, a day that is observed on Madiba's birthday. The lecture this year was Tackling the Inequality Pandemic, a new social contract for a new era. Now, former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, an anti-apartheid activist in his own right, is joining us now to reflect on Madiba's legacy and to talk more about inequalities that still exist and what can be done about them practically for us to resolve issues like that and, of course, poverty. Mr. Manuel, good afternoon, and thank you very much for your time. We've listened to Antonio Guterres speaking about the inequality pandemic. And in South Africa, I mean, like everywhere else in the world, COVID-19 has really exposed it very starkly. We are in tough times. The world is in turmoil.
Yes, indeed. In fact, I want to lift from this afternoon's lecture two bookends. The first would be the very apt observation by the Secretary General that COVID-19 came a bit like an X-ray that exposed the fragility of the system and exposed inequality everywhere, and that's what we're seeing around the world. So that's at the one end. At the other end was a very powerful quotation of Madiba's that was lifted by Mamgrasa that says that poverty and inequality are man-made and therefore must be resolved by people. I think that kind of describes the message that I take out of this lecture very, very strongly. And that is why I think that we must recognize it for what it is and we must seek to find solutions where they present. And from my perspective, it's more than just a statement of beliefs, and it's more than laws, because in South Africa, I think we have our statement of beliefs well encapsulated in the Constitution, especially in the preamble and the Bill of Rights. And we have laws that protect lives, but against that, we must recognize that the attitude sometimes will entrench inequality. And I was very moved yesterday by a judgment in the North Gauteng High Court relating to access of children to school nutrition. And when a judge has to tell a government that you must feed children because the absence of poverty, and in the words of the judge, or the absence of food is obscene, then you are entrenching inequality in a way that is manifest. And so I'm saying it's beyond what we normally look for, laws and budgets, and blaming somebody else, and recognize that because it is man-made, we must resolve it by appropriate action and also by consequences for those who don't act within the letter and spirit of what we want to be as a country that cares for all of our people, especially the poor.
I mean, Mr. Manuel, I'm smiling here. You don't see me when you refer to the Constitution, because before we started the lecture, I actually printed the preamble of the Constitution, because I'm thinking, like everybody tells us in the world, we have the best Constitution in the world. The Bill of Rights is contained in it. Now you are saying it's up to us as men, as human beings, as people, to make the change. What needs to be done now? We have the right laws in place, the right policies in place.
I think that part of what we have to do is be adult and take responsibility for what exists and what doesn't exist. We've had democracy for 26 years. We can't continue to blame apartheid for the failings of the past 26 years. You have to be able to ensure that the policies are implemented. We must ensure that the policies are well resourced, and we must take action in circumstances that advances policy, and we must also be seen to be taking action in circumstances that prevents policy implementation. Amongst the issues that is a major, major blot on the copybook of our democratic South Africa is corruption. We should not tolerate any corruption and maladministration, because what it always does is to steal from the poor. It doesn't steal from the state, it steals from the poor. It denies them access to the very necessary public services. And unless you have public services that are determined and focused, and I like the emphasis that Secretary General Guterres put on preschool education this afternoon, because you can only deal with intergenerational poverty and denial by starting early in children's lives. And the way in which you framed the education discussion in response to a question by Nikiwe Bikicha was, it's not just about university education, it's about education in totality. And that, I think, is the bulwark that Madiba spoke about when he spoke about education being the great leveler. It's doing those kinds of things and measuring the change. If we don't measure what's happening in society, we won't effect transformation. And I think we still are on this journey of transformation, because the battle against inequality is a battle for improvement in the lives of the poorest. And that is what democracy must require of us. In the same way, our message against racism must be unambiguous and strong. And also in the course of this week, I was very, very moved by Makaya Ntini's story. It made it to the top, was a Proteas bowler, had taken 10 wickets in a match at Lords and was treated like nothing when his contract was terminated. All of that is deeply embedded in the psyche of people who've never seen those who come from poverty as being their equals. And these are the things we have to change. And I think that there was sufficient packed into the lecture by the UN Secretary General this afternoon that speaks to our consciousness, that requires appropriate action by us, not just to recite the words in the Constitution, but to own them and to be known by the deeds that we perform.
And another point he made, which sort of stood out for me, was that the growing gaps, as he said, in trust between people, institutions and leaders is threatening us all, because the Secretary General points out in his lecture, Mr. Manuel, that people want social and economic systems that work for everyone.
I think that's very important. I think that we've heard President Ramaphosa speak about the need for a new social compact. The emphasis that was made by everybody this afternoon again, that emerging from the crisis of COVID-19, we cannot reproduce the same system and institutions that carried us in through 2019 and before that. We have to focus on change. And this means that we must ask all segments of society to commit to trust. We need leadership that is strong, that calls out wrong actions, and we must make a commitment. We don't have perfection. We don't have a society that we wished we have. We must know what this society is. We must talk about it honestly and openly. We must recognize that which remains to be done, and we must focus our attention on dealing with those kinds of issues. I thought that at various points in our history we'd attended to that, but every time we fail to implement the decisions that we've taken, we set ourselves back, not just to the last point, but in fact, the world is moving ahead as well, and we are left behind. And so as a nation, I think we must recommit, we must bind, we must take that preamble to our constitution, recognize that what South Africa needs is to remedy not just the last 26 years, but also the injustices of the past that are still there, and take appropriate action and recognize that it doesn't just depend on the government, it depends on all of us, by the small things we do and by the big things we do, by how we convene and how we call out things that are wrong, because that is where the difference will come from. I was very, very moved by the messages from the Secretary General and those who went before, including Prof. Ndebele, by the way in which Nikita asked the questions, and by Mamgrasa's wrapping up this afternoon.
Now, finally, Mr. Manuel, before we conclude, if you may, in a minute, if you can, the Secretary General spoke about a new global deal. You're a former finance minister. You've dealt with international financial institutions. He also spoke about the need for some form of debt relief and suspension of debt for low and middle income countries. This new global deal that he says should be based on fair globalization, on the rights and dignity of every human being. Is it possible?
Well, we have to believe that it's possible. Right now, I'm privileged to be one of the African Union COVID envoys, and the first order of business for us is to try and secure at least 2 years of relief of debt service costs for all of Africa. And there I'm entirely aligned with the SG. It's not just the least developed countries, but all of Africa that needs that. At the moment, we're sitting in a position where about $35 billion flows off the continent by way of debt service costs each year. If we can save that $70 billion, put it to good use, ensure that we have health systems that can deal with COVID, but also that we can improve on the livelihoods of people, then I think we lay the basis for emerging from COVID much, much stronger. And so the G20 finance ministers are meeting today. We hope they've got the message there about this new deal. And the first order of that is to ensure that debt relief is delivered to the world's poorest people. And many of us, the poorest people of the world, are on the African continent. And then we must ensure that there's a fairer system of trade. And that, I think, will also be an important issue. And the third issue, and he just touched on it tangentially, is to ensure that the wealthiest countries don't grab the medications that will deal with COVID. And so the battle against vaccine and health nationalism, we're seeing some countries that have a lot of money that want the first vaccines for themselves alone. We've got to counteract that and ensure that these medications are available to people across the world, and that it's not just available in one go, but on a continuous basis. These are all the issues that I think will be important in constructing this new deal. These are the actions that we can put in place, lobby for, campaign for, unite around, and ensure that we can measure the change going forward.
Trevor Manuel, thank you very much as always. And of course, as the UN Secretary General quoted Nelson Mandela this afternoon, for those things to happen, we have to reinstill what Madiba said is a consciousness of our people, that sense of human solidarity, of being in the world for one another and because of and through others. Thank you very much for your time and some of your insights this morning following the lecture, Mr. Manuel. We'll have to leave it there for now. Trevor Manuel there giving us some of his insights, of course, after the delivery by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres earlier this afternoon.